Excuse me. We're ready? Okay.
We're live. We're live.
All right, go ahead and get started.
We're live.
I'd like to welcome everyone to the June 26, 2023 meeting of the Institutional Risk and Compliance Committee of the University of Rhode Island Board of Trustees. The meeting is being held in person with committee members participating remotely. At this time, I will conduct a roll call attendance to determine if a quorum is present. Please respond present via WebEx or present in person when your name is called. Robbie Luna, present via WebEx. Matthew Lenz.
Present via WebEx.
Richard Humphrey. Joseph Formicola.
Present via WebEx.
Hi, Joseph. Good to meet you. Riva Goyal.
Via WebEx.
Riva, welcome. David Caprio. President Parlange, Mark Parlange.
President WebEx.
We have a quorum. I'd also like to announce that Board Chair Margot Cook is also present and participating as an invited guest. Just a reminder to all members that for the benefit of our audience and the note taker, please clearly identify yourself whenever you comment, make a motion, or second to a motion. Participants using WebEx are required to keep their cameras on as remote members, and all persons present at the meeting location must be clearly audible and visible to each other. At this time, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Rhode Island occupies the traditional homeland of the Narragansett Nation and the Niantic people. I'd also like to welcome the newest members of the URI Board of Trustees in this committee, Joe Formicola and Student Representative Riva Goyal. I'd like to thank outgoing trustees Karina Montilla Edmonds and Mike McNally for their service to the board and to the committee. Our new primary liaison, Abby Benson, Interim Vice President of Finance and Administration, is here to guide us through this agenda. So the first order of business is the amendment of the agenda. May I have a motion to move the executive session last and move discussion items up to be our first order of business?
So moved, Matt Lenz.
Any discussions on the item, on the motion, sorry? There being no discussion, I'll ask for a voice vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Any abstentions? The motion is approved. The next order of business is we're actually going to defer the approval of minutes since Joe is just joining us today and didn't participate in the last session. So we're going to defer the approval of minutes to the September session.
I think he could simply abstain if you have sufficient numbers to vote without having to defer approval.
No, we won't. So we only have 3 of 4 to make the quorum possible, and that would only make 2 of us, right?
You only need 2 of the 3 that are actually present and participating to take a vote.
Okay. Well, then I will
make a movement to approve those minutes.
Okay, so the second order of business is approval of the minutes. We have a motion that the Institutional Risk and Compliance Committee approve the minutes of the April 18th, 2023 committee meeting.
Matt Lenz, so moved.
Any discussion on the motion? There being no discussion, I'll ask for a voice vote.
Aye.
Aye.
Any abstentions? The motion to approve the minutes of the April 18th, 2023 meeting is approved. The next item on the agenda is we're going to move discussion items up in the agenda. Bear with me one second here. So that's agenda item 3, discussion items. So the first discussion item, item 3A, is the review of external auditing plan, enclosure 3A. Abby, if you can run us through this discussion item.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to actually turn it over to Angela Miller, our Assistant Vice President for Financial Operations and Controller, who will introduce Mike Johns, our external auditor, who's going to go over our external auditing plan while I share my screen. Angela.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to introduce you to Michael Johns, who will be joining us. As you will recall, we engaged CLA last year, so they will be entering their second year of our audit as our auditors. And he will walk you through their approach and some key takeaways in the audit environment. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Angela. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here. I was told we have some time constraints, so I'm going to keep this presentation to under 10 minutes. Therefore, I won't get through all these slides, but I am always available after this meeting to discuss further with any of the committee members, any questions or concerns they may have. But if we can move ahead in the presentation, we're going to start with the 2022 single audit results. The single audit is what the federal government requires an auditor to audit compliance with major federal programs. So this is an audit of those compliance requirements that the federal government gives us. And last year, the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund was selected as the major program. CLA does not select the major programs. They are selected by the state of Rhode Island, and we're told which ones to audit. We expressed a clean opinion on that major program and in internal controls over that program. We did have one finding to report, and that was a piece of information that was missing from the required report out on the university's website, specifically related to how many students were eligible to receive grant aid under this Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund program. But that did not modify our opinion, and the university received an unqualified opinion as it relates to compliance with this program. Next slide, please. So this is the starting point for our fiscal year that ends June 30th, 2023 audit process. So this would be the start of that process where we get together with governance and communicate what we're required to under our professional standards. So we were engaged to express an opinion on the university's financial statements for that time period. Along with that, we will issue a report under government auditing standards that notes any matters we identify that need to be reported as it relates to internal controls and other matters. If necessary, we'll issue a formal letter if we identify any deficiencies in the internal control structure, and we'll also issue a formal letter to this group again at the end of the audit, as well as meeting with this group to discuss how the audit went and any findings we had. And finally, we were engaged to review the federal Form 990T for the university. That's the tax return that's required when you have unrelated business income. Next slide, please. So generally, there's various levels of responsibility with the audit process. Probably hard to read this slide, but management's responsible for the internal control structure at the university, for preparing and fairly presenting the financial information of the university. Our responsibilities are, once management's completed the financial close, to perform tests over that data and review the disclosures related to that data and make sure they're fairly presented in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. We do take a look at the internal controls at the university and in some cases perform tests. However, we do not express an opinion on the internal control structure. That doesn't occur during an audit of the financial statements. Next slide, please. General outline of the timing. Planning has started. So we've sent over a request list and gotten some information back where we perform our planning procedures, getting an understanding of any changes at the university, any new significant financial transactions and internal controls. The nuts and bolts of the audit, the main blocking and tackling, that occurs in August timeframe. And that will start the second, third week of August and go to mid-September. The final financial statements are due to the state on September 30th. So that's the deadline we're all working to. And so we perform our tests, and those last 2 weeks of September is financial reporting, getting the financial statements complete and accurate, and getting through CLA's quality review process. Next slide, please.
Come on in. Thank you.
We're required to perform a risk-based audit. So we assess risk and perform procedures where we see more risk that either error or fraud could occur. This slide's broken into the four different types of risks we identify, and that's how we create our audit plan. The first just being what we consider a fraud risk or significant risk. That includes a management override of controls. Did management override controls to reach a certain financial result? And revenue recognition is always a significant risk, and that's is revenue recorded in the correct period? Are the receivables accurate? Any deferrals accurate? Control risk is the risk that the university's internal control structure would not prevent or detect an error. I noted we do test some of the cycles and internal controls, most notably over general disbursements and payroll disbursements. But we assess risk based on our understanding of the controls at the university. And if it was deemed a higher risk due to the controls, we would perform more procedures in that area. Detection risk, because in an audit, we don't audit every single transaction that occurred during the year. We couldn't do there. We'd be there for half the year, and we would wear out our welcome at the university. So we have to calculate what we call materiality. And we use that based on the total revenues, total assets, other financial metrics of the university. And then we make samples of transactions to enable us to express our opinion. Because we do it that way, there's always a risk. Because we don't audit every transaction, there would be a misstatement. So to combat that risk, we perform different procedures each year as an element of unpredictability. And we also use some data analytics. So taking every transaction that occurred during the year, uploading it into our software, and then looking for unusual trends or occurrences. Next slide, please. I talked about materiality. We calculate 3 levels, which are noted here, and I won't go through the statistical theory underlying that chart, so we can go to the next slide. So we always ask, and we're required to communicate with governance, and I will reach out to the chair of this committee and conduct a little bit of a longer interview and discussion. But just in general, you don't have to answer them now. My contact information is available to everyone at the end of this presentation. But if there's any areas you're concerned with, any areas of risk, anything you have questions on that doesn't seem complete or accurate with the financial information you're reviewing, or if you have knowledge of any fraud, I'll pause for a second and see if anyone has anything they want to discuss. And if not, again, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always available. Okay, hearing none, we can go to the next slide. So we have some, we're asked when we do these meetings, just what are the trends we're seeing as it relates to finance and higher education, or higher education in general? What are we hearing governance and management groups talking about? And because I only have 2 minutes left, I certainly won't go over every bullet on this slide. But some things I want to point out just from the accounting side of the shop. I think everyone's seeing an increase in salary costs, and we're also seeing, specific to the finance administration, a lack of qualified finance professionals. The pool seems to dried up since COVID. Not sure where everyone went, but a lot of our clients are having trouble hiring qualified finance folks to manage the finances of a university. And with that, a lot of folks are retiring in key leadership positions. That's not just in the finance world, but the whole university world. And we're seeing a lot of talk about a strategic plan to fill those vacancies when they do occur. And then, of course, the enrollment cliff that I believe is that's the amount of high school students graduating. So the population of folks who can attend colleges and universities, that cliff coming in 2025. So just a smaller pool of eligible students that will be able to enroll in colleges and universities. Next slide, please. Not going to go over this slide. It's just a reminder that there are new cybersecurity laws required by the federal government under the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act that the university was required to implement as of June 9th. We've been asked to test at a very, very high level by the Department of Education. Some of these changes, we just put it in here as a reminder to governance that hopefully your IT group's reporting out to you on the compliance with this, these changes that are required. Next slide, please.
Mike, just before we get a little further, this is Matt on the board. A question on those emerging trends. Does your audit take a look at where we're positioned to react to those trends?
No. So we're not forward looking. We're expressing an opinion on the results of the financial statements. So that's more historically looking than forward looking to those trends.
Thank you.
Moody's put out their report earlier this year on their outlook on higher education, and they revised that report from a stable outlook to a negative outlook. And really, this 6-7 page report is all summarized by one chart they had where they're projecting that expenses will continue to increase due to inflation and other factors in the labor markets, and they're expecting revenues not to increase at the same rate. And the most significant reason for that fact is the end of the COVID funding, and they're not seeing colleges and universities able to replace that funding. And they see a chart where expenses are going like this, revenues are going like this, and the question that a lot of places are asking is, how do we fill that void now that those COVID emergency funds are gone? Next slide, please. So I think that I'm at my 10 minutes, so I don't want to keep everyone. The next bunch of slides were all on compliance matters, and I'm sure as much everyone would like to hear an hour presentation on new accounting standards. We'll postpone that for today, and I'm happy to address any questions. And again, my contact information is at the end of this presentation if you'd like to reach out for a one-on-one conversation.
Thanks, Mike. Any questions for Mike before we move on?
Mike, I would just, it's Margot, I would just ask, just from a general knowledge standpoint, how often you run across educational institutions, public, having an internal audit area to interact with, or is it just not a common thing?
I would say it is common, and the larger the institution, the more likely they are to either have an internal audit department of their own, or sometimes I see in other states a shared internal audit where it's coming from some central higher education administration, and then they go to the various state institutions and perform tests at the request of governance. So I would say it is common. It's probably best practice, but it does vary. The smaller the size of the schools, you maybe don't see it too much. The larger schools usually have their own. There's also a trend for outsourcing this, where you don't have to hire an employee, or the state doesn't have to hire employees, where professional service providers will provide an internal audit function, which would potentially save some money depending on what you're looking at having done.
Okay, thanks.
The next discussion item is discussion item 3B, Title IX update. Kara, if you could provide any of those updates for us, thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. So I too will be brief. It shouldn't take very long to really run through the meat of this. So, okay. So the last time I spoke to this group about Title IX was back in January, when we were anticipating that the Department of Education would issue the new Title IX regulations in May. They had proposed them last June and thought they would be able to publish final versions in May. They did not meet their own deadline. And so they've delayed the final regulations until October, which would make them effective in December or January. So before I talk about the impact of that delay, I'm just going to go quickly through what we talked about back in January to refresh everyone's memory, and for those who may not have been here. So the major proposed changes that are part of the new regulations is around definitions and jurisdiction primarily. It greatly expands the definitions of sex discrimination and sex-based harassment under Title IX to include all things around sex stereotypes and gender identity related issues, as well as pregnancy or pregnancy related conditions. It also reverts back to the previous jurisdiction prior to the 2020 regulations, where it included off-campus conduct and activity outside the United States. So wherever the university has disciplinary reach for employees or students, conduct falling within the definition of sex discrimination and sex-based harassment can be addressed through Title IX. It also goes back to the temporal timing issue of complaints. Currently, the 2020 regulations require that complaints be filed while an individual is attempting or actually participating in our education programs and activities. Now it goes back to if anytime, even after they leave the university, someone can still file a complaint. And the reason for that is primarily the fear that people who leave the university because of sexual misconduct that was perpetrated will then have lost any right to seek a resolution of that through the university. Other things that are discussed in the new proposed regulations is the scope of the responsibility of the Title IX coordinator and the Title IX program. It clarifies that it is the responsibility of Title IX to ensure that the education programs and activities are free from prohibited sex discrimination at all times, and that we are required to take action to end the prohibited sex discrimination, prevent recurrence, and remedy effects. That's all kind of implicit in the whole setup of Title IX, but it is now an issue of accountability where the university can actually be held accountable through the Department of Education's enforcement actions if they feel that we are not doing this. As well as we must monitor for barriers to any reporting and take steps to address barriers that might be preventing people from reporting. Currently, we only have mandatory reporting by employees who have authority to take corrective action, and those are people that we have identified as primarily deans and VPs. Now it goes back to 3 categories of employees who are mandated reporters going forward upon the new regulations: employees who have authority to take corrective action as currently now, and for any incidents involving students, employees who have responsibility for administrative leadership, teaching, or advising, which basically brings in the entire academic function of the university, and any other non-confidential employees are obligated to either notify the Title IX coordinator that they've received information of a violation, or to provide the person making the report with that information to contact the Title IX. We also are now going to be required to train employees and students on the reporting obligations, and there are changes to the grievance procedures. The current procedures require live hearings with live cross-examination. That's now no longer required, but there are certain instances of involving students in higher education where live hearings will still be required. So with this delay, particularly a delay that puts the publication of the new regulations in the middle of an academic year, that's going to create a bit of a challenge for the university, as it will with every institution of education. It's going to impact our policies and procedures. Middle of an academic year, we'll talk about that, and it involves administering parallel processes. So first, with policy and procedures, one is the timing of board approval. Our policy currently is a board policy, and I had indicated in January that we were anticipating a June approval because we thought the new regulations would be published and finalized in May. So now we would probably be looking to get board approval in November. Because if they drop in October and they're effective in December, January will be too late. September is probably too early, so we're going to look at bringing it to the board in November. This also will impact how we communicate to the community, because for the first semester, we will be operating under existing policy and procedures. And then For the second semester, that will change. So we're going to have a different kind of communication plan than when you start the entire academic year with a new set of procedures. And then there are issues around the publication of policy and procedures. And this has to do with the idea that while we have a new policy coming to be approved, it is only effective going forward from the effective date of the regulations. But that doesn't mean that conduct that occurred prior to that policy won't be reported during the new policy period. So we will have to sort of keep two policies live for a while, and we'll have to figure out how to make sure that that is not confusing for the community. So implementation in the middle of the academic year, obviously Title IX jurisdiction is problematic. It'll be one thing first semester, it'll be another the second semester. It'll be much broader the second semester. So we're going to be probably seeing a significant increase in the types of reports, a variety of reports, and increase in the number of reports starting in the second semester. Reporting is also impacted again because you may not be a mandatory reporter first semester. You're a mandatory reporter second semester. So we've got to make sure that we have our reporting pathways very clear between the two periods when more than one policy will be effective. And then training as well, because under the new regulations, we have to train all students and employees. And so come January, we will have to be rolling out a different looking training than the one we currently have. We're all set to train the first years as we do every year on this issue. And we are not going to be changing that because it will apply for their first semester. But then we're going to have a different training that we roll out when the new regulations are effective. Now, the parallel resolution processes is the stickiest part because we have to look at which grievance procedures are going to apply to the conduct at issue. And that involves when the incident happened and when the report comes in. So the rule of thumb is that you apply the policy that was in effect on the date that the conduct occurred, but you use the procedures that are in effect on the date it was reported. So if we have an instance of sexual misconduct in the fall, and we have the current policy apply to that, if they report it, or if it's reported in March, then the new procedures will govern how it's resolved. So we'll be using definitions and jurisdiction based on the date of the incident, and we'll be using resolution procedures based on the date of the report. And investigations and hearings are then also going to be in flux in terms of when the incident occurred and when it was reported, in terms of what's relevant, what gets investigated, and how the hearing is run. So the upshot is that we are basically going to be running two policies and two sets of procedures for some period of time in tandem. And so our challenge is, one, meeting all of the compliance obligations of both sets of regulations, because depending upon when the misconduct occurred is going to kind of run that, be the engine for which path we have to go down. So any questions? Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kara. The next item on the agenda is item 4, action items. Action item 4A is the review of a request for an exemption for Ethics Code Section 1.2H submitted by URI employee Azure Sigler and of the related conflict of interest management plan under the Public-Private Partnership Act and the URI policy on public-private partnership in research and development, and a recommendation to the Board of Trustees. So enclosure 4A covers this action item. Peter Harrington, if you could walk us through this action item, please.
Sure. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Robbie. I will also keep it brief. This matter concerns a request for an exemption from a provision of the Rhode Island Ethics Code, Section 1.2H, which is being sought by URI employee Azur Seigler. Her exemption is being sought under the Public-Private Partnership Act, a 2003 law, which allows URI employees and URI to participate in research and development activities, such as receipt of funding by an employee startup company, licensing of technology to that company, or as in this case, entering into a contract with a company that an employee owns or has a 10% or greater ownership interest in. So under the Act, the Public-Private Partnership Act, and the implementing URI policy, Public-Private Partnership Policy, employees seeking an exemption require approval first of the Conflict of Interest Committee of URI, then of the Vice President for Research, then the President, and then lastly, our Board of Trustees. So this is coming to you to make a recommendation to the board on this request. In this case, the applicant is Azur Seigler. She works in the Graduate School of Oceanography as a Marine Associate 4, and she wants an exemption under 1.2. The reason being that provision of the Ethics Code, 1.2H, prohibits the university from entering into a contract with employee-owned companies, unless it's done through a public procurement, which isn't the case here. So it is a technical requirement of the code that she needs the exemption from in order to allow her company that goes by the name of Rhodey Wild Sea Gardens to enter into a research agreement with the university. Here's the basic facts you need to know. You may have gleaned this from your packet. I'll just hit the highlights. Azur's job at the university does not involve research. It's facilitating meetings, convening seafood sector meetings, creating reports, outreach materials, and hosting webinars and events. So on her own time as a private citizen, she started this company called Rhodey Wild Sea Garden is the name. The legal name is A-Team Coastal LLC. It's a Rhode Island company, and their business is to obtain, through foraging of seaweed, a certain kind of seaweed called sugar kelp, and her company is developing it into animal feed supplements or food supplements. So her company would like another researcher in another college at the university, Dr. Maria Hoffman, to do some analytical work and research pertaining to her company's activities, essentially running testing on collected sugar kelp. The research is of interest to Dr. Hoffman. She's a researcher in cells in the Department of Fisheries, Animal, and Veterinary Sciences. To facilitate this, Azur Seigler's company received an innovation voucher grant award from Rhode Island Commerce for $50,000. It was an application process and a competitive grant process, and the money would be paid to the University of Rhode Island to fund Dr. Hoffman's work in her lab, along with one of her graduate students to perform the work. The other thing of interest is to say that the contract here, in other words, the agreement to be entered into between URI and the company, is a very standard collaborative research agreement. It's very even-handed. I was involved myself in preparing it, and it has very standard IP terms and standard publication terms. The business terms are completely fair to both parties, so it's a very arm's length, equitable agreement, and that's what Azur needs the exemption for, to allow URI to enter into that agreement with their company. The other item in your packet is the Conflict of Interest Management Plan that was developed by our Conflicts Committee with Azur Seigler. It has all the protections you would expect. It says, for example, the graduate student can't be forced to participate in the work. It's completely voluntary. Publication of any results is free and open by our researcher and graduate assistant. The IP would be, if there is any IP that results from the research, it would be administered exactly in accordance with URI standard IP policies. She'll report annually to the Conflict of Interest Committee on the progress of the research, and so on. And let's see. So that's really it. And it was, the last thing I'll say is it was somewhat of a case of erring on the side of caution to come and require Azure Cycler to request this exemption. We could have made the argument that, well, it was sort of a competitive process at Commerce, even though it wasn't a competitive procurement at URI. We did consult with the Ethics Commission attorney. He said to be careful, you should probably get an exemption. So that's what we're doing. It's the exemption has been approved already by the conflict committee, 5-0 vote about 10 days ago, then by Bethany Jenkins, the interim vice president for research and economic development, then President Parlage. You can see their signatures on both the conflict plan and the application showing their approval. So it's coming before the board and first to your committee for a recommendation to the board. So that's it.
Thank you. I'd like to say that this is the private-public partnership that should be celebrated, and I would love to see more of this as we move forward.
Oh, lastly, just mention one last thing. Mary Wrightford is here. Mary retired, but she's consulting to URI. She was really instrumental in helping organize all this, did a great job. So Mary's here. And Azure Seigler was invited, but I don't know if she was able to make it, but okay.
Margot, you have a question.
Just a quick one. I agree with you, Robbie. I just had a quick question for Peter, and maybe this was in the in some of the documents. How do we? What is the? I understand there's an annual review or like a recertification, but how do we? And not particularly to this case, but how would we know if there's a material ownership that there isn't undue influence, or like how would we monitor those conflicts?
Right. It's a good question, Margot. So the annual review by the committee. So the committee looked carefully. They particularly hear the undue influence, to your point, would have occurred in the terms of the agreement between the company and us. So the committee saw that, as did our VP and president, to see that it appeared arm's length. And then secondly, they reviewed the management plan, which really ensured that Azure will have no involvement at all in the work going on at URI. So it's kind of baked in, the avoidance of the undue influence is baked into the conflict management plan and to the agreement itself. And then, it will be reviewed, as I said, each year by the committee, and they can ask any questions that they want of Azure at that time. So that's really the safeguards that prevent that.
Okay.
There being no more questions, may I have a motion that the Institutional Risk and Compliance Committee of the University of Rhode Island Board of Trustees recommend that the Board of Trustees approve a request for an exemption from Ethics Code Section 1.2H submitted by URI employee Azure Sigler and of the related Conflict of Interest Management Plan under the Public-Private Partnership Act and the URI policy on public-private partnership in research and development as recommended and presented in enclosure 4A. Oh, that was a mouthful. May I have a motion?
Matt Land, so moved.
Is there a second to the motion?
Second, Joe Formicola.
Any discussion on the motion? There being no discussion, I'll ask for a voice vote. All in favor, say yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Second action item is action item B, review of amendments to the Institutional Risk and Compliance Committee Charter and recommendation to the URI Board of Trustees, closure 4B. So there was amendments to the IRCC charter are listed in enclosure 4B to align with changes made to the assignment of board liaisons. The committee reviewed the edits during the April committee meeting, and there were no further edits or suggestions. May I have a motion that the Institutional Risk and Compliance Committee of the URI Board of Trustees recommend that the Board of Trustees approve amendments to committee charter as recommended and presented in enclosure 4B.
So moved, Joe Formicola.
Seconded, Matt Lenz.
Hey, Robbie, I have a question. Sorry. I was confused as to why the Vice President for Research was taken off. A lot of this, as you know, a lot of this committee is about observing and providing governance for the research processes, conflicts, and part of the review is earlier in the year is understanding the standards governing the conduct of research. And that was like, maybe it's not stated very explicitly, but that was an intention of this committee. So I'm curious, I may have missed it. Is something changed there?
We actually I don't believe we made any changes to the structure. If that was an omission, we can go back and take a look at that. But that
Just that the liaison is, the Vice President Research and Economic Development is no longer a liaison.
So the university liaisons are appointed by the university president, and they're intended to be a liaison to the president in sort of agenda development, just assuring that he's signed off and administration is aware of the different agenda items. And so the president underwent a process by which he evaluated the different liaison assignments and figured out, how to allocate that work, because it's largely just being a liaison for purposes of assuring that the agenda is appropriate and has been cleared through the appropriate people in administration. And through that process, he had appointed new liaisons, and that went through the governance committee. And the changes that are reflected in the charters that have gone to the committee are just to reflect those changes that the president had made in the university liaison assignments.
Mark, do you think, so you're saying this is more administrative than content? Because I don't want to lose the connection to Bethany in this committee.
Yeah, Margot, I agree with what you're saying, that's clear, but I think this was reflecting that this was more of an administrative committee. So, there's of course the academic affairs and research committee, which makes sense that the provost and the VP research are there, but
Maybe she just comes to the meeting when we're discussing the governance process.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
And I will point out, if I may, she was intending to be here today because there was a research item on there, but she had an unavoidable conflict. So I know from Alyssa and my perspective as the university liaisons, we certainly will make sure that the interim vice president for research and economic development is involved in all the agenda items involving research risk oversight.
Okay, thanks, Abby.
I still see on the calendar too, the next item after this, that we have the review of standards with conduct of research in February. So I think as long as that remains, it should still be good, right?
Yeah, that's great.
All right. May I have a motion that the Institutional Risk and Compliance Committee of the URI Board of Trustees recommend that the Board of Trustees approve amendments to committee charters recommended and presented in enclosure 4B?
Matt
So
Lentz,
moved.
Matt Lentz seconded.
Are there any discussions on the motion? There being no discussions, I'll ask for a voice vote. All in favor?
Yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? Motion carries. The next action item is the review of amendments to the Institutional Risk and Compliance Committee calendar and recommendation to the URI Board of Trustees, enclosure 4C. So again, this was amendments to the calendar, which are listed in enclosure 4C. The committee reviewed the edits during the April committee meeting, and there were no further edits or suggestions. May I have a motion that the Institutional Risk and Compliance Committee of the URI Board of Trustees recommend that the Board of Trustees approve amendments to the committee calendar as recommended and presented in enclosure 4C?
Matt Lentz, so moved.
Is there a
Joe
second?
Formicola, second.
Thank you. Any discussion on the motion? There being no discussion, I'll ask for a voice vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Unanimous, the motion carries.
Robbie, if I may, you should be indicating aye or nay as well when you call for the vote. I'm assuming you were a yes on those votes.
I was a yes, yes.
Thank you.
Sorry. All right, the next item on the agenda is to go into executive session. And we've got a total of 10 minutes to make this happen.
Ready.
Do you need me to make a motion?
Yeah, I'm sorry. We have a motion to go into executive session.
Matt Len, so moved.
Joe Formicola, second.
Any discussion on the motion? There being no discussion, I'll ask for a voice vote. All in favor?
Yes.
Yes.
We can
Joe
also,
Formicola.
if we could just cite the law real quick. I know we're pressed for time, the Rhode Island General Law on page 4, Robbie. The reason why the 42-46-5A 3.
Sorry, yep, discussion. Yeah, I have a motion that the Institutional Risk and Compliance Committee of the URI Board of Trustees convene into executive session pursuant to RIGL 42-46-5A3 for discussion regarding a matter of security, including but not limited to the deployment of security personnel or devices, specifically to review the university cybersecurity plan.
Joe Formicola, so moved.
Matt Len, seconded.
Any discussion on the motion? There being no discussion, I'll ask for a voice vote. All in favor?
Joe Formicola, yes.
Yes?
Yes, yes.
Okay. The motion is approved. We will now go into executive session.
Should I take any out?
Looks like we're shut out of the exec session.
Okay, sounds good. I will drop then.
We're the only ones in it, so in this breakout room, so that to me says we've been excluded.
Okay.
We can
Okay.
jump off. Sarah, what do
Yeah.
you think? All right. I was wondering if we should jump off anyway, as soon as they said that. I was just about ready to, I am Abby. All right, guys, have a good day.
All right. Thank you. You too.
You too, Angela.
We're live. Robbie, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. The next item on the agenda is item 5, motion to adjourn. May I have a motion to adjourn?
I think we gotta seal those minutes first,
We have to
right?
seal the minutes.
Oh, whoops.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
If you go up to page 6, Robbie, on your agenda, I believe it is.
Yeah. The middle of the page. The first order of business in open session.
Yep. The last order of business is open
Yes.
session. A motion to seal the executive session minutes. May I have a motion that the minutes of the Institutional Risk and Compliance Committee's executive session be sealed?
Matt Len, so moved.
Joe Formicola, second.
Any discussion on the motion? There being no discussion, I'll ask for a voice vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion is approved. And now, the next item on the agenda is item 5, a motion to adjourn. May I have a motion to adjourn?
Joe Formicola, so moved.
Matt Len, seconded.
Any discussion on the motion? There being no discussion, I'll ask for a voice vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Yes. Any opposed? Motion carries. The next URI Board of Trustees Institutional Risk and Compliance Committee meeting is tentatively scheduled for September 2023. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy your